We can test out Monster Hunter Wilds performance. I'm playing the game right now live, and we'll do it on a variety of PCs that I've put together, somewhat based on the system requirements for the game, which definitely looked scary when I first saw them and talked about them. So let's remind ourselves what those specs are and how that correlates to the hardware that I'm testing. Also, the main thing I saw when I saw these system requirements was that it looked like it could potentially have severe CPU bottlenecking based on reading into the system requirements, so it'll be interesting to test that out in today's video. The actual minimum spec GPU was a GTX 1660 Super. I don't have one of those. I've decided I could either go lower with like my 1060 or a little bit higher with my RTX 2060. I've decided to go a little higher with the 2060 because that will give us access to DLSS upscaling, and we'll see if that can do anything for us. But I'm more concerned about the potential for CPU bottlenecking. And I don't have any of the CPUs they're listing here. They list a 10600. I have a 9600K, so one generation behind this. And I also don't have a Ryzen 5 3600. So anyway, the point is we're a little bit behind their minimum spec CPU listed here for Intel, and a little bit above the minimum spec GPU, but in general in the ballpark of the minimum system specs, which they said was only targeting 30 FPS at 1080p, but not even a real 1080p. They're talking about a 1080p output upscaled from 720p. In other words, like DLSS or FSR Quality upscaling to 1080p monitor. The recommended specs for the game include a Ryzen 5 3600X or an 11600K, 12400, Ryzen 5 5500. I don't have any of these exact CPUs, but I did put together a build with a Ryzen 5 5600X. For one thing, that's a pretty common gaming CPU. It's also in a ballpark of the performance of the Core i5 12400, which is listed here. And I also have this exact GPU with the RX 6700 XT. Thought that'd be good to get an AMD build, as well as, again, it is listed here, and it's also a bit more powerful than what the GPU in a PlayStation 5, for example. So that'll be interesting. The third PC I put together is just absolutely monster. It's a 7800X3D and an RTX 4090. Now, let's go ahead and jump into the actual testing on the PC that's designed to be similar to the min spec to see how bad this actually is, and was I correct that it's likely a CPU bottleneck in a lot of situations. Anyway, let's jump into the testing. So here we are. I've played until we got to the base camp kind of town area, and it is, as I feared, a CPU bottleneck on weaker CPUs. You can see that we're hovering in the 30 to 40 FPS range, and the frame time graph is going absolutely nuts. But if you look up here at the GPU usage, you can see the GPU is only hanging out around 70-something% range, indicating the GPU's just waiting. The GPU could go faster. But why is it not going faster? I'm showing all of my CPU cores, and you can see that all of them are pegged in the like 80 to 90% range a lot of the time. Now, when you're looking into CPU bottlenecks, if any core is near 100%, everything else in the game has to wait for that. And in this case, it's not even just one core. It is trying to use all the 6 cores and 6 threads that the i5 9600K has here, but it's not able to go any faster than what these are able to deliver. So you're absolutely going to be CPU bottlenecked. And to be clear, we're on the absolute lowest settings. And by absolute going to be CPU bottlenecked, I mean if you're on kind of a older CPU, right? This is a mid-range i5 from, you know, what was the 9600K, like 6 years ago or so, something like that. So anyway, if we go ahead and look at the types of graphics settings that we're doing here, I went to the lowest preset. So we are on DLSS Ultra Performance, which means we're coming from like below 540p. I think if I remember right on the resolution scaling on this is lower than a 50% per axis scaling to try to output to 1080p. On the absolute lowest graphics settings here, it's just honestly it looks very bad at these settings, and despite looking terrible, we are not getting very good performance. Like I said, in this little town environment, we're hanging out in the 30 FPS range. Now, the one silver lining of being CPU bottlenecked, which is what we're doing here, is that being at the lowest possible graphic settings actually isn't really helping us because we're CPU bottlenecked and most graphic settings affect the GPU. So the one thing I would say here is I could probably get off of this DLSS Ultra Performance. And by the way, the game auto-selected this for me. So if you're starting up this game and you feel like it looks really blurry, you might want to check if FSR or DLSS is turned on onto a ridiculously aggressive setting. And you could try a less aggressive setting like Quality, for example, which is what I'm going to try here. This would be going from 720p to 1080p, which is actually what the game's system requirements were based on. And if I do that, notice that our performance is pretty much the same, but the GPU utilization is higher now, a little bit higher. But again, the overall performance is about the same, but the game looks better now because it's rendering at a higher internal rendering resolution. So in other words, what do you do when you're CPU bottlenecked? You actually turn up graphics settings until both the GPU and the CPU are more equally utilized because your GPU is waiting around anyway. Unfortunately, how do you get the CPU to perform better? You hope the game developers optimize this game before February, better for the CPU. Anyway, we could also maybe even try turning off upscaling entirely. Would be another option, and maybe just switch to TAA. You could also have tried DLAA, and this again will put more burden on the GPU. And now we can see that my GPU is in the kind of 90% utilization range, and the CPU is also around that, 90 to 100% utilization range. So what we're seeing here is slightly lower overall frame rates because there's more of a GPU limit happening. But the game, again, is looking better because we're at least rendering at a native 1080p, although the overall graphic settings are very low. So what I'm going to overall say here is it seems like on a weaker CPU like the i5-9600K, you're absolutely going to be reaching CPU limits in the 30 to 40 FPS range, at least in areas with a lot of NPCs like we're getting here. In which case, try to find balanced graphics settings that get your GPU up to near full utilization. Otherwise, you're wasting its performance. In other words, there's not anything you can really do frame rate wise to push through that bottleneck, but you could at least try to make it look as good as you can at that frame rate. So that's what we could do here. Now, another option is we could switch to FSR 3 in order to enable frame generation. Frame generation doesn't rely on the CPU to hit higher frame rates. So this will boost frame rates higher than we were seeing before. Also, this is now aggressively upscaled again, so you can see it looks extremely fizzly and blurry looking again. But like I said, this is now giving us a higher output frame rate. Now, the upscaling amount is absolutely insane here. It looks really, really blurry on Ultra Performance there. Maybe we'll go down to Quality. So here we're at a 720p internal rendering resolution, and then using frame generation to try to double it, which isn't reliant on the CPU because the game's actually not responsive to those frames. It's just the game kind of taking two frames you had and guessing what happened in between on your GPU. This does not make the game more responsive, but it can make the game look smoother in its rendering. So if we do that, yes, we are able to now hit near 60 FPS. We're still CPU bottlenecked if you look at the CPU usage and GPU usage here, but the overall frame rates are higher. So anyway, if you're CPU bottlenecked and want a higher frame rate, frame generation can get you more output frames, but again, it's not making the game more responsive. It might smooth things out in motion on your display though. All right, I think we've seen what happens on a low spec system, especially on the GPU. So I think it's time to pop in something close to the recommended specs. Again, I'm going to be using a Ryzen 5 5600X based CPU. So similar to this 12400 from Intel, but kind of from AMD, and a bit above what they're recommending for the AMD CPU. And again, I'll be using the 6700 XT. All right, let me pop in that system and edit the video together to let you know what happened. And what do you know, we are once again CPU limited. It is as I feared from the system requirements list. The fact that they were recommending frame generation to try to get to 60 FPS, even on a fairly powerful GPU like the 6700 XT, was the giveaway. We are hanging out around 40 frames per second right now, but the GPU is sitting at 60%-ish utilization. And the 6-core 12-thread CPU, you can absolutely see that some cores, even though it's not all of them, are hanging up in that upper 80s, 90-something% range, indicating that we are CPU bottlenecked. The GPU is waiting on the CPU, and that is limiting our overall frame rate. You can see that we are dipping into the 40s a lot in this kind of town area. And yeah, it's definitely a CPU limit. Now, as far as what graphic settings I'm using, it's based on the recommended system requirements, which is, this is 1080p medium settings, upscaled from 720p. So this is FSR Quality. However, I did not yet enable the frame generation that they were indicating to use in the system requirements list. So this is what we look at here. I've just chose the medium preset, but then disabled upscaling. Well, I turned upscaling to quality. It had defaulted to Ultra Performance. Now, since we're CPU limited, our GPU has enough headroom that I think it might make sense to switch that to native AA. So rather than trying to upscale from a lower internal rendering resolution, we could render at a native 1080p resolution and get better image quality. You can see that the GPU is now up closer to the 80 to 90% utilization, and our overall frame rates are similar to what we were getting before. So again, things look a little bit better, and we're still getting about the same performance. Again, that's kind of trying to make the best of a CPU bottleneck situation. And then again, the other thing you can do to make the best of a CPU bottleneck situation is to kick on frame generation to get the more output FPS to your monitor, even if the game is not becoming more responsive. In that case, you can see that we are now able to output, looks like we're up into the 90 FPS range of motion fluidity, although still dipping into the 70s and the 80s. But again, my mouse movements now, I can tell they feel a little bit floaty. That's kind of the compromise of using frame generation, especially from a lower input frame rate. Now, if you're playing on a controller, you might not feel it as much because it's less of a one-to-one movement than a mouse movement. But that's kind of the downside to frame generation. Again, it can introduce a little bit of latency as it delays showing you a frame that was ready in order to interpolate what's happening between two frames and then output the frame that's kind of in between, if that makes sense. Now, the other thing I could say here is that this also means we could probably get away with a higher resolution rather than just 1080p as another way to take advantage of more GPU headroom, because increasing the resolution shouldn't really be messing with the CPU limited situation, if that makes sense. So that's the kind of other silver lining here. But yeah, it looks like definitely not able to hit 60 FPS even on a Ryzen 5 5600X CPU, at least in this town area, which is a bit rough. Now let's go ahead and take a look at how does an absolute monster fastest gaming CPU you can put, sorry, not just CPU, but fastest gaming system you can put together try to handle this game. I'll go pop in that system and we'll see what happens. Okay, we now have the absolute maximum gaming PC that you can build. This is a 7800X 3D and an RTX 4090. This is 4K resolution now instead of 1080p like our last couple of tests. And I've completely maxed out the graphic settings. This is Ultra, and we are at not just native 4K rendering resolution, but using DLAA as a high-quality anti-aliasing, which, again, actually has more demand than just using like TAA. Anyway, the point is, it looks like at a native 4K absolutely maxed out settings, we can hit around 60 FPS with occasional small dips. Also, the GPU usage you can see is around 97, 98%, occasionally dipping down to around 95, 96%, indicating that the GPU may be occasionally waiting for either, things to be streaming in or memory or the CPU, but it's not much. This is mostly a GPU limited set of settings that we've indicated here. Now, if you're like, that hardware can't go beyond 60 FPS, no, that's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying this is it absolutely maxed out at 4K resolution natively. I'll say the game certainly looks a lot better maxed out at 4K than it did at those lower settings. 'Cause one thing I'll say is on those lower settings, I really didn't think the game even looked that great, despite the pretty significant performance demands. I'm still not going to say that I think this is like the most glorious looking game I've ever seen, but it certainly looks a lot better at its maxed out settings and high resolutions than it did at the lower settings. But let's go ahead and see what if I'm on this high-end hardware, so I don't want to play at 60 FPS. I would like higher frame rates. The first thing I'm going to look at is what if we use some rendering resolution scaling. I'm actually curious if we go all the way down to performance mode upscaling, which at 4K output resolution is a 1080p internal rendering resolution, but then has the DLSS algorithm has some performance cost as it then upscales to a 4K image. The point is this should lighten the burden on the GPU quite a bit, and we can start to see if we run into CPU limited issues on even a 7800X3D. So let's go ahead and try this out. I'm going to set some frame rate average counters here. Looks like at DLSS performance, but otherwise maxed out ultra settings, and running around the town area, the GPU is bouncing between the 80 and 90% range, indicating that there's at least some GPU waiting for the rest of the system, indicating that there could be some CPU bottleneck or memory bottleneck or streaming from whatever, bottleneck. Now, if we look at the CPU cores, you can see that the overall CPU is only 50-something% utilized. But if you look at the individual cores, you'll often see an 80-something% core bouncing around. And what that usually indicates is that the primary game thread is fairly close to being maxed out. And again, the game can't run faster than that primary game thread. And which core that game thread is currently sitting on can change in the sampling interval that this is reporting, which would show why it might not report 100% on any particular core, even if the game is actually CPU limited and running at about 100% on one particular core. In other words, I think we're seeing about the limit of the 7800X3D here. It might be able to go a bit faster, but we're definitely kind of reaching the peak of the CPU performance here, I think, underlying. Now, if I stop running around, the overall frame rate does seem to go up a bit. The GPU utilization maybe goes up a bit. But if I turn, like new things are revealed, the GPU usage, again, drops a little bit as I think it waits on kind of the rest of the system to kind of process that. Anyway, so it looks like a 7800X3D can maintain over 60 FPS, and the 1% lows are looking like about 54, 55-ish running around this town area. So I don't know if the full game will have an area that is more CPU demanding than this town area. It's certainly possible, but it seems like at least in the how far I've made it in the beta, this seemed to be one of the more CPU demanding areas. All right, so I think that kind of shows the limits of what this system can do. You're going to get CPU limited even on high-end CPUs at certainly over 60 FPS, but it just doesn't look like this game is going to push high frame rates without frame generation, even on really heavy-duty CPUs. That's the one other thing we could do here again, though, is kick on frame generation. And because this CPU is able to run well over 60 FPS without frame generation, that means that the overall kind of floaty feeling on the mouse is nowhere near as bad as when you're coming from a lower resolution. Sorry, not lower, a lower frame rate, because the actual frame rate is still fairly high. You can see that now our frame rates are around 120 FPS or so. But remember that the actual game is only running at about half of that, and then the frame generation is just kind of filling in the gaps in the output to the monitor. But anyway, that's what I've got for you guys today. Do keep in mind when judging the game that this is not the final release of the game. That comes in February. So I'm hoping that this beta test allows the developers to get a lot of data for how it's running on various systems, consoles, and PC, and then hopefully be able to implement some optimizations, because I would say that especially the CPU bottlenecking is particularly concerning here. And the other thing that concerns me is that even on some GPUs, it is still fairly heavy, and when you turn down the graphic settings and the internal rendering resolution, a lot, the game doesn't really seem to scale very gracefully from what it looks like, in my opinion. I think on the lower settings, the game can look honestly quite bad, but still not perform particularly well. While it looks a lot nicer on these max settings, you can see that you need a pretty high-end system to handle that. All right, guys, hopefully you guys found the video useful and or interesting. Always feel free to, do the like and subscribe thing, or even click the join button to financially support what I'm doing here, along with some little benefits. And I hope all of you have an excellent day.